and specifically how it pertains to the RRR. Remember, the RRR was the percent of reserves that banks must keep and not loan out. So we made a $1,000 bill. I think it ended up with Erin at the end for her souvenir. And as it transacted through society, each bank had to keep some selection of the money, 10% of it, I think is what we used in class, but then the rest of it they loaned out. So what we saw was that one initial $1,000 deposit effectively was reused over and over and over and over in society. And from society's point of view, if we polled each individual member that had that money and said, well, what was your money supply at the time? They would have said 900, 810, 729, and so on and so forth as it moved through our little model. Which meant that this money being reused effectively increased usage in society, or supply in society, by more than that initial $1,000 deposit. And that's what we said was the money multiplier. I want to know the total effect. What is the total effect? Effectively, how many people are using that money? Now you do have two mathematical options that you can utilize to solve this. One is exactly like we did in class last time. You can start with whatever the starting deposit is and continuously reduce it by the percent of the RRR. So we could have just kept passing it around and kept scratching it off, so the next person it would have been 72.90, and then the next person 65.31, and we could eventually reduce that. And will you get the correct answer? Yep. What's the problem? Is you won't even finish one problem on the exam, because it would take over the hour of our class time to actually solve it that way. Luckily, there is a formula that we can use. It's very similar, for those of you who are finance program, to the finance multipliers. There is a formula that we can use to solve the overall or total effect on money supply. We can use, again, our money multiplier, 1 over the RRR, and we do this as a decimal, times whatever the initial deposit or reserve was. So whatever our initial deposit, or from the bank's point of view, the initial reserves they took in before they loaned it out, we can then solve for the total effect in society. So in our class, what did we start with? We started with $1,000. Our RRR, I believe, was 10%, so I'd have 1 over 0.1. So 1 divided by 0.1 times 1,000 gives me a value of $10,000. So that would be the total effect in terms of that supply from society's point of view. If I went and polled everyone who had money, how much did you have, and added up, we would get $10,000. So the whole point of this is to remember to say, well, what happens if the Federal Reserve changes the RRR? Well, let's change the RRR. Let's make it 5%. I can redo my equation now as 1 over 5% is 0.05 times that $1,000. And I would get a total effect on money supply of $20,000. So what is the effect here? Well, because banks are allowed to loan out more, it would keep our cycle going longer. It would take more and more and more people before it ran out to effectively zero, when banks couldn't loan out anything. And because it keeps that cycle of passing down that $1,000 bill in class going longer, more people, when polled, said, oh yeah, I was holding some money. So effectively, it appears as if we have, well, a greater supply of money in society. So effectively, what did we see? We see that if the RRR falls, money supply increases. There is more money available for transactions. We can show this in our graph. right? Again, we're not too worried just yet about our vertical axes. We'll tackle that whenever we get to money demand. But we said this was quantity of money, right? Quantity of M2. Or you could just write quantity of money. And we said that there was some initial X value, or just if you want to get, variables, Q1 for money supply. Well, what happened? Well, we went from 10,000, we have a number for X now, 10,000 if you want to use the numbers, to 20,000, which would be a rightward movement. Q2, 20,000. And at all variable interactions of money supply, that's how much money there is. So effectively, by lowering the RRR, the money supply as a function has shifted or moved to the right. The reverse works as well, so I'm not going to go through all of the steps here because it's kind of just obvious. If the RRR is increased, the long-term effect is that money supply would be decreased, which would shift to the left. This down, it is done and over. Hope some of you guys went to this. I actually had some students come in today and say that it was super beneficial, so hopefully you did make it. I asked them for copies of their notes because I couldn't make it. So if the RRR is increased, money supply decreases, shifting it to the left. Now I did put this in the long run strategy. The reason I put this in the long run strategy is because the Federal Reserve does not change the RRR frequently. And if they do decide to change it, it's not something that's going to take effect tomorrow. It's not like, hey, today the RRR is 5%, tomorrow it's going to be 10%. Everyone figure it out. They can't do it. It takes a long time for banks to adjust their balances to make sure that they can fluctuate how much money they have to keep in. The Federal Reserve knows this. They know they can't just change the RRR on a whim. So anytime they do want to change the RRR, they announce it publicly, and it's typically at minimum 6 months advance notice, sometimes more. It's done that way to give banks time to make that adjustment so that when we get to the point that they've selected, the date, the deadline that they've selected, banks can have that much in reserve, in balance, either within their own bank or being held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will keep bank balances if it's a lot of cash because, well, banks don't want to keep a lot of cash on hand. So they have to keep that in reserve. It does sometimes give us a great indication of the Fed's long-run goals. If the Fed comes out and says, hey, next year, on January 1st, we're going to raise the RRR to 15%. Well, that gives us an indication of what they're trying to do. They're raising the interest rate. Their long-run strategy is to reduce the amount of money supply available in society. So it's not something that we expect to see have a daily effect, even a weekly, probably not even a monthly effect. But it is a long-term indicator of what the Federal Reserve is looking to do. So that was one of the things that was in our long-term, our long-run, header from last class. We have a couple of other ones that are, other long-run opportunities. The first one is called the federal funds rate. Abbreviated FFR. The federal funds rate is the interest rate banks are legally allowed. Federal funds rate is the interest rate banks are legally allowed to charge each other on loans. Federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks are legally allowed to charge each other when making loans. First, just a little quick disclaimer. Don't even need to put this in your notes, but those of you who are econ majors, there's a class that you take later on. It's called Money and Banking. If you're an econ major, you should definitely take it. And it's literally, part 2 of our syllabus over a whole semester. So a lot more detail. As you build your money market in that class, your axes up here will probably be measuring the federal funds rate. That'll be the one that you're looking at with a lot more detail. In this class, we give it a lot less detail. Again, the whole semester devoted to it. All right, but I want to give you the gist of it. So federal funds rate, the rate that banks are legally allowed to charge each other for loans. You might say, well, why would a bank ever need to get a loan from another bank? It's actually an incredibly common process. It's typically done whenever banks need a lot of money quickly to loan out themselves. So let me just kind of give you a scenario here. Last class, I think I mentioned that St. Louis is one of the biggest concentrations of small banks in the country. We have a whole lot of little banks here. Now we do still have some really large branches, but they're not headquartered in St. Louis. The city of St. Louis also has a charter agreement, something built into the laws of St. Louis, that if we have the ability to transact with a local company, you need to do it. Or you at least need to give them the right to make an offer, make a presentation. So if something big needs to be built in the city of St. Louis, if the city is going to build something, there's a law within our town charter that says you need to go to St. Louis businesses to have the work done, including banks. So they need to at least go to the St. Louis banks, the locally owned ones, and see if they can get a loan. Now, because a lot of the banks in St. Louis are relatively small, they may not have a lot of money on hand to loan out. A couple of years ago, they were debating on whether or not to build a new stadium for the Rams, which eventually did get approved. They said, yep, we're going to do it, and then the Rams left anyway. Whole different scenario to talk about. The Rams left anyway. Well, let's pretend for a moment that the Rams did not leave. And the city of St. Louis needed to get these funds. The city of St. Louis was going to be on the hook for $500 million. It was $500 million. So the first thing they need to do is they need to transact with local business. So they need to go to a local bank. There's a bank. It's convenient. It's on Southwest Boulevard, and it's called Southwest Bank. I think they've got 3 branches now. But it's on Southwest, not Boulevard, Avenue. So let's just hypothetically assume that's the one they go to. It's a local bank. They go and they say, we'd like $500 million. It's not a very big bank. They may not have $500 million that they can just loan out on the spot. They don't want to lose the city of St. Louis as a customer. Right? I mean, that's a great return on that investment. So they have other options. They can go to bigger banks themselves, like Bank of America, and say, how much could we borrow X amount of money for, $500 million for? If that interest rate is lower than the interest rate that they're charging the city of St. Louis, the transaction goes through. Right? They borrow the money from Bank of America at 2%. They loan it out to the city of St. Louis at 4%. And they keep the 2% profit. All of that seems pretty standard, makes sense. One thing we didn't think about it, though, was from Bank of America's perspective. If Bank of America knows that the city of St. Louis would pay 4% on this loan, wouldn't they make more profit going to the city of St. Louis and saying, hey, we'll make the loan at 4%, and cutting out the middleman entirely? Absolutely. The federal funds rate is set by the Federal Reserve to prevent this. It's put in place to protect small banks from being undercut by large banks just to steal their customers. Because from Bank of America's perspective, that makes more sense, right? The small Southwest bank comes and says, we'd like to borrow money. If Bank of America is free to decide what they'll charge, they'll say, oh, okay, yeah, we'll loan it to you at 7%. Or, arbitrary made up. And Southwest Bank says, we can't do that. The market rate for this loan is 4%. That's all we're going to get for our customer. And Bank of America would say, too bad. Not really. Because we're going to go to your customer instead and we're going to make this loan. So that's why this is kind of set by the Federal Reserve. It's to level the playing field so big banks cannot undercut small banks and steal their clients. If the federal funds rate is lowered, what's going to happen? Well, if the federal funds rate is lowered, more small banks are going to start looking to those bigger banks and saying, hey, we're going to borrow more money right now. We're going to borrow more money because we don't have to get it at as big of an interest rate. Just the same behavior you guys as consumers have. Low interest rates, you want to borrow more. So now our small banks are wanting to borrow more and more money, which means they're going to make more and more loans, which means what? Well, more of those $1,000 bills are going to be started through society and start circulating through, and more transactions occur. More people have money, so that view from society of money supplied means that if the federal funds rate falls, money supply in society increases. You got money, speaking of money. Your money supply almost fell. The reverse is true as well. If the federal funds rate is increased, money supply would be decreased. And again, it looks the same, increase in money supply, shift, MS right, decrease, shift, MS left. They do change the federal funds rate with a little bit more frequency than the RRR, but it, again, is typically something that they announce publicly that they're going to change. They typically do it significantly far in advance, or at least that they plan on changing it. They may not, say a specific date, but they'll say, hey, we're gonna, look towards the end of the year and we're gonna change this. That's kind of common, but again, it's something they usually like to have enough advance notice so society can start making adjustments and they can start looking for those customers to make those loans occur. Okay, and then our other long run effect. The Federal Reserve can change the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that banks can borrow money from the Federal Reserve at. The discount rate that banks can borrow the money from the Federal Reserve at. Okay. When it comes down to it, the Federal Reserve is a bank. Remember I said last class, they are responsible for all of their operating, all of their paying employees, all of their building new buildings, whatever they need to pay, which means they got to get money too. The way they make money is the exact same as every other bank. They loan out money, collect interest. The discount rate, as it implies, is typically set lower than the federal funds rate. So it's kind of funny because, we said, hey, they're going to set the federal funds rate to kind of level the playing field. We don't want any undercutting. But when it comes to us, yeah, we're going to undercut all you guys and have this lower interest rate. The intent is to have banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve. So if a bank needs needs a loan to have it happen through the Federal Reserve, it is typically at a lower rate than the federal funds rate. It's got a discount built into it. There are a couple of differences. One, there is not the fear that the Federal Reserve is going to actively seek out other banks' clients, which is, like what we said, kind of we were worried about with Bank of America, and I'm just using Bank of America as an example of a big bank. I'm not saying they would actually do that. But, they're not going to seek out other banks' clients because remember, they're legally not allowed to keep their profit. So because that, that idea of having all of this leftover profit really is a gone incentive, it's not there. We don't think that the Federal Reserve is actually trying to undercut banks to try to go to their clientele. And one of the reasons is the Federal Reserve does not loan to private businesses. They will only loan to other banks. That is, I bet you, Dr. Ray Patch, who is our money and banking expert, could probably give you a few examples of violation of that historically where they've loaned to some kind of big company. It just really doesn't happen, though. The Federal Reserve is only loaning to banks. The only exception I could ever think of is there was several years ago, there was an instance where they had to loan to a private company because of national security regulations. They couldn't release information to the banking sector because a lot of banks are public entities. But even that it's super rare. They're only going to loan to banks. Beyond that, it works the exact same way, right? If the federal funds rate went down, money supply went up. If the discount rate goes down, guess what? Money supply goes up. Same strategy, same story. More banks will be coming, getting loans, which then they'll process out through society. If the discount rate rises, money supply falls. So you'll notice all of these rates have the same effect. Increasing the RRR, right? That's a rate. Increasing the FFR, increasing the DR, all have the same effect of reducing money supply. So all of the rates behave the same. Kind of helpful in terms of it's kind of helpful in terms of understanding and building this model. All of our long-run effects are conducted by the Board of Governors. So all of these policies are brought about by the Board of Governors, and they decide in their meetings what they're going to set it at. Okay, so let's talk about some short-run effects now. With our short-run effects, we have to go to the second tier of the Federal Reserve. Right? Our first tier was the Board of Governors. They're taking care of all of that stuff. Our second tier, remember, was the FOMC. And the chief goal of the FOMC, we said last class, was that they're going to be the entity that does the daily transactions, what we call open market operations. Open market operations are the daily buying and selling of government bonds in the bond market. The buying and selling of government bonds in the bond market. A bond is an IOU from the government. Aaron, do you still have that $1,000 or did you throw it away?
No.
All right. Someone, I need another piece of paper. A bond is an IOU from the government. So in your finance class, you guys learn about stocks, right? In Econ, they say, oh, don't teach about stocks at all because we don't want to step on finance's toes. Fair enough, fine. But you learned about stocks, and effectively a stock is when you go and you loan money to a company. Effectively, the company's cutting out the bank as the middleman. They're going to society and saying, hey, we need a lot of money, we're going to build something or whatever. We're selling stock. Whenever we make profit on that stock, you get a share of it, a dividend. A bond is going to be the same thing, except for this is the government. The government saying, we need to get some money. So they look to society. and say, okay, well, can we borrow money from you? We'll pay you back over a period of time with interest. So that's kind of how like a bond is set up. They typically sell them in long-term increments. 5-year, 10-year, 30-year notes. They lately have not had very good interest rates at all, as kind of everything has not had good interest rates in terms of their rate of return. So you probably wouldn't have bought one recently. I don't know, maybe. But if you have one, you probably had one from like when you were a kid. Or, that was always like a popular gift for grandparents when a kid was born or when they turned 1 or whatever. They would go get them a savings bond. They would get them a treasury bill. And it wouldn't mature for 20 years or something along those lines. Those transactions were occurring by the FOMC. Those are the open market operations. So what is the effect on money supply? Okay, well, here we go. I have this beautiful bond right here. Oh, we'll make it a lot. We'll make you guys rich. $1 million. So the Federal Reserve is going to sell this bond, right? I'll be the Federal Reserve. I currently have it in my holding. I want to sell this bond, $1 million bond. Who wants it? You don't actually have to have any money. Just pretend. Who wants it? Jordan? Okay, here you go. Jordan, here's this $1 million bond. Okay, give me money, please. Pretend money. Thank you. What has happened? Oh, here. She's really, really trying. I know. If you could have waited 5 seconds, it would have been nice. You still would have got it. That's all right. She was dying here. What happened? I just took money as the Federal Reserve out of society. That money now goes into the vault where the bond was kept. And can anyone use it to transact? No. When the Federal Reserve sells that bond as a daily transaction, the bond goes into society, the money goes into the Federal Reserve. So when they sell the bond, money supply falls. Right? And again, we can make a picture of this here. We're still not worrying about this over here. That's okay. We will in a few minutes. Here's our money supply at Q1. And the Federal Reserve sold a bond. Jordan just bought it. And what happened? We pulled $1 million out of society. So money supply fell to Q2. Shifting money supply to the left. What about the other way here? This is not going to be a surprise, it's just the opposite. So let's say that Jordan, that your bond is matured. Whenever your bond matures, you have 2 options. You can roll the investment, which means you just do nothing. In fact, most of them are automatically set up to roll unless you tell it to do something, which will then reinvest. It will buy a new bond at the value of your existing bond plus whatever interest you have earned. Or, when your bond matures, you can cash out some portion or all of that bond. So you can say, well, I want cash for half and then I'll roll the half. Or you can just say, I want all my cash now. You can do either one. So let's say Jordan's bond has matured and she says, all right, I want to get rid of it. What she would be doing then is that the Fed would come and say, we'll buy your bond back. The Fed will hold the bond in their vault and they're going to give her $1 million plus whatever interest. And what's happened? Now Jordan has $1 million, which she can use to buy stuff, and then our money cycle starts spreading through society, and everyone in society is going to say, yep, I saw some money, I saw some money. So when the Fed buys the bonds, money supply increases, shifts to the right. I know my little game is kind of stupid. Thanks for Jordan playing along. It totally helps. Think about it like when you're taking the test or doing your homework. Pretend, make yourself a little pretend bond. Say, hey, I'm the Fed. What am I doing? Okay, money goes away. I see people doing it, so I know it helps because I see people acting it out on the exam, which is kind of funny. But nonetheless, I know it helps. So yeah, silly little story. These bond transactions are done daily, every day that the market is open. So Monday through Friday, sans holiday. This allows the Federal Reserve to change the money supply on a daily measure. In a very rare case, they can even buy bonds before they mature and waive any penalties. They can do that if they want to start pulling in a lot of bonds and start shelling out a lot of money. It can happen, but typically they're waiting till the bond matures before the Fed buys it back, but they're selling them every day. It used to be done through a secondary market, which meant that there was an intermediary. You didn't buy directly from the government or the Federal Reserve. You actually went to your bank and they called them savings bonds. And that was like way back in the day. They were paper. And again, you might have one from your grandma or somebody like that when you were born. And it's probably just locked away in the safety deposit box. And it literally is a paper bond that has some value, some mature date, and usually on the back they have a whole bunch of lines so you could track the interest if you actually wanted to. Today, that's not the case. If you go to your bank and say, I'd like to buy a bond, odds are they won't even know what you're talking about anymore because they don't do it that way anymore. It is now all done electronically. So this bond market effectively is open 24/7, but the transaction will process during market hours. So you can go online and we could make it a class project if you wanted to. We won't because I won't make you invest at that horribly low interest rate. But you could right now and go online and start buying bonds. The Fed would sell it to you. Your money goes out of society. They hold on to it. So this is done daily. It does allow for that daily flexibility to change the money supply. We then have one more Fed option. Kind of a short run, long run, both. It's done very, very, very quickly. It has long-lasting implications. And that's quantitative easing. We're very uncreative in economics with our abbreviations. So QE. But that is one that they typically talk about in society. They refer to them in periods. So there was QE1, there was QE2. Quantitative easing round 1, quantitative easing round 2, etc. Quantitative easing occurs when the Federal Reserve buys financial assets as a way to increase the money supply. When the Federal Reserve buys financial assets as a way to increase the money supply. So it can only cause money supply to go up. That's it. That's its only thing. Typically, quantitative easing is done when the interest rate is already very close to zero, because the Federal Reserve has been buying bonds for so long that they have to start buying other things. So I guess I'll give you kind of, has anyone studied quantitative easing at all? Oh no, so we need all the basics. Okay, so here, a little outside of the book realm, but real life stuff that we might need to know. Okay, so I doubt anyone in here has got a home, right? No one's bought a home yet, no one has a mortgage. Okay, when you go buy a mortgage, what's probably going to happen within the first 6 months on the outside is your mortgage is going to get sold. In fact, it's very common that a mortgage over the 30-year span of its lifetime will get bought and sold several times. 3 to 5 times is pretty standard. In fact, some may be more if you started with some smaller banks. They don't just sell one mortgage. They sell them in huge groups of what they call a block. So let me kind of give you the kind of the gist of it. So Megan, let's say hypothetically you buy a house. You've now got a mortgage where you're paying some bank 4% over 30 years. Okay, that's great. That means that bank's going to have money coming in for 30 years. But remember, how does the bank make money? They make money by consistently loaning out money. They don't want to wait 30 years before they have all of your money. So what they'll do is they're going to take your mortgage and they're going to sell it to a bigger entity that has a lot of capital. They're getting 4% from you. They're going to sell your mortgage to another bank for, I don't know, 2%. They will get all of that money up front, so a $100,000 loan plus the 2% interest, which then they will re-loan out to reinvest. The group that bought your mortgage, they don't have to do any of the paperwork. They don't have to do the underwriting. They don't have to verify your credit because the first bank already did that. So their cost is significantly lower. All they have to have is a lot of capital to be able to buy that mortgage, and then a lot of patience. They don't have to do anything else. Over the next 30 years, they're going to consistently get paid every month. And in the long run, they're going to make that 4%. So they net 2% extra and don't really have any of that initial startup work. This is pretty common. Banks sell to bigger banks, to bigger banks, to bigger banks, and it eventually usually goes to one of the mortgage clearing houses. So I'm sure in the news somewhere you heard about like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mac. Those were mortgage clearing houses. One of them right now is Penny Mac. That's one of the biggest ones in the country right now, where they are going and they are buying blocks of these mortgages all at once. Okay, the reason they buy them in a block is because they don't want to look at each individual transaction. They don't want to spend that money and say, well, let's look at Megan's mortgage and see if this is worthwhile. Well, she makes this much, she has this job for this long. They don't want to do that. Instead, they buy a block knowing that there's a risk of some rate of default. Okay, 3% of the mortgages in this block of 100 are going to default. They take that into account in their balance. The Federal Reserve does the same thing from time to time. They will go and buy these blocks, and they won't buy just a small amount. They will buy trillions of dollars at once. So whenever we say financial assets, that means they're going to these banks or maybe to these clearing houses and saying, we're going to buy one of these blocks of mortgages. The Federal Reserve isn't doing it to make a profit. Remember, that's not their goal. Instead, they're using it as a way to make a massive drop of money into society. Right? We're buying $1 trillion block of mortgages. Bam, there it is. Here's $1 trillion to the bank that sold it to us. Which then that bank is going to start loaning that money out, and our cycle starts. People buy, things, they redeposit it, loans out, and it cycles through again. So quantitative easing is a massive increase of money supply all at once. It's done relatively quickly. Over time, the Federal Reserve will sell off those assets. They'll sell them kind of like bonds. Okay, banks want some extra assets to hold on to. Perfect, we'll sell some here, we'll sell some there. But at once, whenever they buy that huge block, it allows an incredibly huge deposit of money into society. Officially, the Federal Reserve, since 2000s, officially has done two rounds, if you will, of quantitative easing. Unofficially, they've done 3. What that means is they've really actually done 3, just for whatever reason, they don't want to admit the third one. I don't know why. So if you actually go to the Federal Reserve, they call it a different event, but they don't actually call it quantitative easing, but it was the same thing. So since 2000, they've done it, we'll call it 3 times, where they've made these massive deposits of money into society. So again, that's another Federal Reserve policy, only a money supply increase. Any questions on it? Did I kind of sum it up well enough? Because I know that's in the news a lot, and if no one kind of knew what it was, yeah.
Is that kind of how the 2008 housing bubble?
Yeah, that's not occurred. That happened afterwards.
Oh.
Their quantitative easing rounds were in 9 and 11, maybe thereabout. The housing bubble was a demand-driven one. And we just started seeing demand go up, 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 up as interest rates were kind of held low, and home values were going up. And well, a home is valuable, but it's also a collection of commodities, and that collection of commodities has a value. And as that collection of commodities valued down, we saw that the value of the home was less than what it was actually sold for. Quantitative easing was one of their strategies to try to correct that. to try to get people to start spending money and buying things again. Yeah.
Does this happen with any type of loan, or is it usually
In terms of what we mean by asset, it's almost always mortgage. It could be other things, but it's almost always mortgage. Whether that's corporate mortgage, consumer mortgage, who knows, probably a blend. But it's almost always some kind of mortgage. Any other ones? Okay, good. I know that was a little aside, but I think it's just something that they talk about in the news, so we guess we should kind of know. Okay, so we've got part of our model done. I want to go now to the other side of our model and talk about money demand. The demand for money, right? Effectively saying society wants money. We expect money demand, like everything we've seen, to follow the law of demand. But what does that mean for money demand? So I'm going to kind of give you the formal way of thinking about it, and then we'll do a little bit more simplistic way. The formal way is accurate. The simplistic way helps us understand the model and get the right answers, so it's kind of nice to see both. Formally, money demand follows the law of demand because of what we call the theory of liquidity preference. The theory of liquidity preference. This theory states people prefer to keep their money more liquid. People prefer to keep their money more liquid. In parentheses, because this will be a pain in the butt trying to review this, put as cash on hand. Just in parentheses, like cash in, my wallet, my whatever, as cash. People prefer to keep their money more liquid, so like as cash, at low interest rates, and prefer to keep their money less liquid so now in parentheses put like in a savings account. At high interest rates. So one thing that we took away from the loanable funds model, we had the interest rate. We called it R. And we said R was effectively the price of money. If you wanted to borrow it, you would have to pay back some amount. And we also talked about this idea of saving it. That's where kind of our theory of liquidity preference comes into play. If I were to now build this model that showed quantity of money opposed to interest rates, if the interest rate is really, 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 really high, you as a person would not keep a lot of money on hand. If you had extra money, you would put it into your savings account or some kind of interest-bearing account. So you would not keep it as cash on hand. You would deposit it into the bank. So the amount of M2 that you as a person at any given time are holding is relatively low. If the interest rate is super, super low, way down here, and then you're like, you know what, it's honestly not even worth my time to go to the bank and make a deposit or type up the electronic transfer online, or I'll just keep the cash. You'll keep it as cash on hand. So at low interest rates, you're going to keep your money more liquid as cash on hand because it's not worth it to go to the bank and get 0.01%. and not have as easy or convenient access to it. At high interest rates, hey, if you were getting 10% out of a savings account, you'd be like, you know what, I'm going to make that trip. And if it means I don't have as much spending money this weekend, who cares? I'll go to the bank next week. We connect these, and sure enough, we get that downward sloping money demand. Okay, there's some more real life things that we need to talk about, like, for example, what if the interest rate is 0? Like it is, or close to it, because that has an impact, as well as then kind of changing and shifting this model. But we'll be completely done with the money market by Friday, for sure, and wholly into Chapter 7.